said he's on his way back. Thinking stopping in Kansas City tonight and then be at home hopefully tomorrow, but continue to pray for him. A safe trip back home from moving Hannah to Denver. As I mentioned this morning, the cleaning is the Latinis and Dave Dickerson for this month. So I just assist them in any way you can with picking up and all as we leave. This is probably a good thing to do each week as we leave to make it easier for those who are cleaning. The Wednesday night invitation is Dustin. Dustin is down for that, so we look forward to what he prepared on Wednesday night. An additional announcement I didn't have this morning, the ladies' Bible class is this Thursday. That's at 7:30, so should be getting an email, ladies, if you're attending that and have been participating in that and be prepared for that. So put that on the calendar if it's not already. And I also mentioned let's pray for Andrew, who's away from us down in Pensacola, Florida. He'll be finishing up his training sometime in the next couple of months, I assume. And so we'll look forward to having him back here. But we do miss him, and we continue to pray for him that he'll be able to come back after his training is over. The order of worship for this afternoon, the opening prayer at the appropriate time, Fletcher will be called on for that. Communion will be headed by Brian if anyone needs to take the Lord's Supper this afternoon. Matt is our song leader this afternoon. Song number 298 is our first song. So if you're using a song book, turn to 298. We'll be singing that song in just a moment. Jeremy will be preaching for us this afternoon, and he's gave us the title this morning, and we look forward to that. I think it's about manliness, along those lines of what we had from last Sunday. And then the closing prayer at the appropriate time when we close services, Scott Elders will be leading that word of prayer. So those are all the announcements I have at this time, but if there's anything else we need to get announced and that we can have it announced in the email tomorrow, just let me know or let Jeremy know to put in the email tomorrow. Okay, let's enter into our worship service now, 298.
Thanks to Jeremy's lesson last week, I'm going to attempt to meet time tonight. I've been practicing, so if I suddenly stop part of the way through, it doesn't mean stop singing. It just means I've abandoned all hope of being able to do it. So, sing 298. Love lifted me. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. Very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. All my heart to Him I give, ever to Him I'll cling. In His blessed presence live, ever His praise to sing. Love so mighty and so true, merits my soul's best song. Faithful, loving service to Him belongs. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me, love lifted me. Love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Souls in danger look above, Jesus completely saved. He will lift you by His love out of the angry grave. He's the master of the sea, billows His will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted healing, love lifted healing. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Love lifted me. Love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Next we'll sing number 529. 529. In heavenly armor we'll enter the land. The battle belongs to the Lord. Each breath fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. When the power of darkness comes in like a flood, the battle belongs to the Lord. He's raised up a standard, the power of his blood. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. When your enemy presses in hard, do not fear. The battle belongs to the Lord. Take courage, my friend, your redemption is near. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. Now have our opening prayer.
Dear Lord, thanks for another day to come and worship you. Through Jeremy as he brings the lessons, may we be locked in and take what we learn and put it into practice. Be with those that are sick, the expectant mothers. Be with Andrew. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Is there anyone here who's not had the opportunity to take the Lord's Supper? I do not see anyone. So we'll sing 658. 658 before Jeremy brings us the lesson. $658. All the way my Savior leads me, what have I to ask beside? Can I doubt his tender mercy, who through life has been my God? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, hear my faith in him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. All the way my Savior leads me, cheers each winding path I tread, gives me grace for every trial, feeds me with the living bread. Though my weary steps may falter, and my soul athirst may be, gushing from of joy I see. All the way my Savior leads me, oh, the fullness of His love, perfect rest to me is promised in my Father's house above. When my spirit floated mortal, wings its flight to realms of day. This my song through endless ages, Jesus led me all the way. This my song through endless ages, Jesus led me all the way.
I don't know why I struggle so much to remember to put this lapel mic on. I guess it's because I went years never needing one, always just learning to stay in front of the microphone at the lectern. But it doesn't work when you've got people listening online, and I'm walking around down there. Okay, is that rectified? Now, let's spend a few minutes with the little kids. We have been talking about judges. And we've gone through, I told you at the beginning, we weren't going to talk about every single one of them. There are quite a few to remember, and we don't even know very much about some of these judges, right? But we did talk a little bit about, we talked about Samson last time. We talked about Gideon a week or two ago. And we've been working to memorize the names of all the judges. And you remember we've been working on a song that helps us to remember all those names. So let's go ahead and sing that song. You guys ready? God sent judges over Israel, one great woman, 13 men. They helped Israel fight their battle, led them back to God from sin. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tobiah, Jared, Jephthah, Gibson, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, Samuel. Okay, good job, kids. So we went through and we talked about one of the first ones, Gideon. He's actually sort of in the middle. We talked about him, and we talked about Samson, who's actually the last judge in the book of Judges. Now up there, what we've been singing, we've got Samson and then Eli and Samuel, but Eli and Samuel don't show up until the next book. But there's one more lesson that I think that you kids can get out of the book of Judges. And we start at the beginning, and we talked about this when we first got into this book and started talking about Gideon. The reason that God had to send judges, you remember, was that the people kept turning away from God. And I believe I read you a few verses from Judges chapter 2. I'm going to start in verse 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. So this is kind of like God is their father. God is our father. You guys know that, right? He is our father. We're all his children because he made us. Well, God was the father of the nation of Israel, too. And it's kind of like they're just ignoring him. Can you imagine yourselves doing that, just completely ignoring your parents? Now, in some ways, that sounds pretty good, right? I see one very enthusiastic head nod over there. Oh, that sounds nice, right? Okay, it sounds nice. Why does that sound nice? Aviva, you got an idea? Can you say it again? It's not nice when your parents know. I think I can sort of translate what you're trying to get at there, Aviva, right? You get in trouble with your parents, right? Sometimes your parents are mad at you. Sometimes you do something that your parents have told you not to do, and you get in trouble. That kind of thing. It seems like it'd be pretty nice to not have to deal with that, right? No rules. But what would life really be like without your parents? Who gives you food?
Okay? Ethan's pointing at his mom, yeah? Parents feed you. Who gives you a place to sleep? Parents do, don't they? That's right. Who takes care of you? Who protects you from people that might want to hurt you? Parents. So they make rules, and you might get in trouble with them, and it's not nice when your parents are. It's not. You don't enjoy it when your parents are mad at you. But if you were to do without your parents, you'd be doing without all those great things, and you wouldn't have anybody to take care of you. And that's what happened with the Israelites. When they decided they wanted to do without God, well, then He wasn't there to take care of them either. And so He stopped protecting them, and because they didn't have the rules, and because they didn't have God helping them and feeding them and protecting them, things got worse and worse and worse for them. Life got really hard. At the end of the book of Judges, this is actually something that's mentioned several times, but especially the very last verse of the book. And there's a reason it was chosen as the very last verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So you've got all these people doing what they think is right instead of what God says is right. They were treating it like there were no rules, and that seemed like it was fun, but it was no good. They had problem after problem after problem, and life was really, really difficult. So just like you wouldn't want to do without your parents, and just like your parents come with rules that you have to obey, you wouldn't want to do without God either, would you? God also comes with rules that you have to obey. But when your parents give you rules, do you think that it's just to be mean? Do you think that it's just to make your life hard? Why do they give you rules? Just because? You say it again? I can't hear you. Well, you wouldn't. Well, okay, yeah, you wouldn't know what to do if not for those rules, would you? And you wouldn't know how to take care of yourself. Those rules are there to protect you. Those rules are there to keep you safe. Those rules are there for your own good. And God does the same thing. He did the same thing with the Israelites, and He does the same thing with us. When God tells us things to do, it's not just because. It's because He wants what's best for us. So we need to trust Him. We should learn from the Israelites' mistake. They didn't trust Him. They ignored Him, and they decided they could do without God. It didn't end up very well for them. So that's what this song is about. We'll sing through it. We might go through it twice. It's just about the whole book of Judges. So let's sing this one together. I'll tell you what, Dustin, I'll control this one from up here, okay? Thank you. Take a look in the book of Judges. Take a look and you'll see trouble after trouble, sorrow after sorrow for the people of the Lord. Take a look in the book of Judges. Take a look and you'll see a whole generation of God's holy nation grew up, not knowing the Lord. And the people did what was right. They did. The people did what was right. They did. The people did what was right. They did what was right in their own eyes. And the people did what was evil. They did. The people did what was evil. They did. The people did what was evil. They did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, we went through that a little bit slower than we ordinarily would. Let's go through it one more time, a little bit faster now that you've heard the tune. And hopefully the kiddos can remember this one. It's a really great way, obviously, to remember the whole point of the book of Judges. Take a look in the book of Judges.
Take a look and you'll see. Trouble after trouble, sorrow after sorrow for the people of the Lord. Take a look in the book of Churchill. Take a look and you'll see a whole generation of holy nature grew up, not knowing the Lord. And the people did what was right. They did. The people did what was right. They did. The people did what was right. They did what was right in their own eyes. And the people did what was evil. They did. The people did what was evil. They did. The people did what was evil. They did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord.
Okay, good job, parents and kids alike there. So let's remember to learn from the Israelites' mistake and be willing to accept God's rules, because they're for our own good. If we try to do without His rules, that means we're doing without all His blessings too. We talked recently about men and women in the church, and especially we have talked about the need for real manliness. That was the topic for this last Sunday morning. In contrast, that is, to the world's vision of what manliness is. And at that time, I teased, and Tim mentioned this just a few minutes ago, that we would soon talk about manliness from another perspective, this time Jesus' masculinity. And so that is our topic this afternoon. Whether it's clearly stated in exactly these terms or not, Jesus is often viewed, certainly by people of the world, but even sometimes by Christians, as being passive, as being sort of toothless, docile, soft, kind of a homebody, a talker, as opposed to a doer. Well, let's examine the evidence and see what we can learn about Jesus and then also about ourselves. Jesus actually displays a lot of very masculine traits. For starters, what did he do for a living? Some cushy office job, I'm sure, right? I mean, we've talked about him. He's a talker. He's not so much a doer. He's the one who says turn the other cheek. He's obviously not someone who's got his hands on something tangible that requires strength and skill and maybe has an accident here and there that ends up with shedding some blood. Well, let's turn to Mark chapter 6, verse 3. They're talking about Jesus, and they say, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. This is almost from the beginning. This is the first time that he teaches at Nazareth, where he grew up. And he starts saying some things that they don't like. And funnily enough, they don't say, well, he's a little bit of a girly man, to borrow a term from Arnold Schwarzenegger. But they say he's nothing but a carpenter. Okay, well, be that as it may, look at what he's doing for a living. That's a pretty manly profession, isn't it? It requires some level of physical strength. Even today, it requires some level of physical strength. And keep in mind, of course, that he didn't have access to power tools. He wouldn't have had access to particularly good steel, even. He would have had it, but it would have been pretty crummy by our standards. He would have been doing freehand sharpening on natural stones. I've done some carpentry, some woodwork, and even when you're using just hand tools, boy, it's really helpful to have a nice flat diamond plate and a sharpening jig. Because you can get a super fine, razor sharp edge on something, and then it's very precise, and it doesn't require all that much strength to work. Well, he didn't even have that. And let's keep in mind, he's also not doing the sort of fine woodworking that we might think of. He's not making, tiny little dovetail boxes. He's not doing artsy engraving and really fine detailed work. He's doing carpentry with large pieces of wood. Okay, well, sometimes people get into a job like that because they just have a love for the beauty of that craft, right? And you might even have seen some people who, when you find out what they do for a living, you go, really? That guy or really that girl is doing that? I would never have expected that from looking at them. How did Jesus get into this job? In Matthew chapter 13, we find out. Matthew 13, verse 55. Basically, this is the parallel passage to Mark 6, and we have an extra little detail in verse 55. They say, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" So we knew he was a carpenter. Now we see that it's a family business. And that's how he got into the trade. So he's not some dreamer who, had the opportunity to go to a four-year college and get a finance degree or something, but he decided that he was going to throw all that away because he wanted to be one with the woodwork or something like that. It's very practical. Extremely practical. And he worked with wood because, well, that's what Joseph did. Okay, how long did he do that? Because you've probably known some people who got into a job like that where they really weren't cut out for it, right? And they might last a few months, maybe even a year or two, but eventually it's going to wear them down. Eventually they're going to have to say, I got to get out of this. I've got to do something that involves me using my mind instead of my hands. I'm just not cut out for this kind of work. Luke chapter 3, verse 23. This is right at the beginning of his ministry. It's really introducing his ministry. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, and it goes on down into his genealogy. About 30 years old when he stopped doing carpentry and started preaching. It's my age, roughly. So, considering that it's a family business, surely he grew up doing this. Probably started in his low teens. Let's just say by the time he was 15, at that point, surely Joseph's going to say, you need to be pulling your own weight. You need to be helping out some around here. So he's been doing this for somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 years. Jesus knows what it's like to work for a living, using his hands. Jesus knows what it's like to have blisters and calluses. He knows what it's like to have to put food on the table through the sweat of his brow. That is pretty manly, isn't it? We also see Jesus taking a strong stance for truth and right. And that's one of those masculine characteristics that often kind of goes by the wayside in the world's view. But Jesus certainly didn't let that go by the wayside. In Matthew chapter 23, we actually read part of this passage this morning. Really, this whole chapter is an excellent demonstration, but let's just read a couple of verses, verses 27 and 28. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." These were the most powerful people that weren't Roman, basically, in this era, at that place. He's calling them out pretty harshly, isn't he? He's not just saying, I don't entirely agree with you folks. He's calling them whitewashed tombs. That sounds like a pretty strong insult even for us today. But if you also consider the Israelites' mentality given by God's law toward uncleanness, he's saying they are not just unclean, it's impossible to make them clean because of what they have done with themselves. They've gone so far down that road. There's nothing holy about them. And they're the ones who appear righteous. They're the ones who hold the word of God over everybody else's head. And Jesus is standing up against that, knowing what risk he's taking. And he says, I'm going to say the truth here. That is a very risky thing for him to do, but he had a lot of courage. He was a risk taker, another masculine attribute. He was willing to start a fire because it needed to be started. It's quite manly. He also had influence. That's one of the masculine traits that we have discussed, but it's more that the typical masculine trait is the aspiration to be influential, right? Because most men really aren't going to be very influential. If everybody were influential, then that would mean nobody really is, right? Well, Jesus actually accomplished it. Now, we often measure greatness in a man based on a lasting positive effect on the world, based on this person's influence over others. And so there are really only a handful of men whose names you'll remember that are even 100 years in the past, let alone several hundred or 1,000 or a few thousand years in the past. Those are the ones that we think of as being the great men, right? Well, we have people like Lincoln, very manly, had a very lasting positive impact on the world and certainly on our country. We could go back farther than that in our own country. Washington, another extremely manly figure. Not quite so far back as those, but hopping across the pond, Churchill. Now there's a guy who, in a lot of ways, just to look at him, he's a pudgy guy, he's a relatively short guy. He's not exactly you remember the image that I had of the man's man up there on the screen a week or so ago. Churchill doesn't really compare to that, right? But he had this incredible, lasting, positive impact on the world. And so he's remembered as being a great man because of that. Has anyone had a greater effect on the world than Jesus? Has anyone had a more positive effect on the world than Jesus? Of course not. It's laughable to even make the comparison. Has anyone had more followers than Jesus? Now, maybe if you thought about it in Jesus' time on earth, in the flesh, then he would be actually relatively far down that list. But this goes beyond his life. This goes beyond the time that he spent here on earth. And no one has had more followers than Jesus. Has anyone other than Jesus had more people studying his life, more people writing biographies and sub-biographies, more people writing about his history? Jesus definitely takes the cake there as well. Even in his time on earth in the flesh, he was always a leader followed by thousands of people, and many of those people would willingly listen to and obey and serve him, were willing to do whatever he said. We're not going to take the time to go to these passages, but if you're taking notes in a couple, the note here would be Psalm 110, predicting Jesus, and it includes lines like that God is going to make his enemies a footstool for his feet. In Ephesians 5, the authority that we see that Jesus has over his church. He is the husband, she is his bride, and she is supposed to submit to him in all things. a great level of authority. No one ever has had more authority than Jesus, have they? Jesus also displayed anger. We talked about anger as one of the major masculine attributes, and contrary to what a lot of people would like to tell you about gentle Jesus, meek and mild, Jesus displayed some anger. In John chapter 2, let's read verses 13 through 17. John 2, beginning in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers, and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So here he's not only displaying some anger. We see that in Jesus a number of times. We actually looked at one of them just this morning, where in Mark chapter 3, verse 5, it mentions that he looks at these people in anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. But here we see him not acting, not healing somebody while angry. We see him acting in violence here. In Mark chapter 11, we will read something quite similar. Mark chapter 11, and we will begin in verse 15. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." Okay, so that sounds awfully similar to that one in John chapter 2, doesn't it? In both of these cases, he's getting violent. He's actually driving people out physically. He's not, walking up to them and waiting for his opportunity, tapping them on the shoulder, maybe saying, trying to break into their conversation and saying, I would appreciate it if you guys would leave. You don't belong here. He gets some cords. He uses them as a whip and physically drives people out of the temple. That is a violent act. Was that wrong? I've heard people claim that it was. I've heard people say that that was Jesus sinning. Well, that goes against some of the other passages that we read in the New Testament about him not having committed sin. And that was pretty public. How could they maintain that he was sinless if he had very publicly, very obviously committed an egregious sin like this? Okay, so if that's not sinful for him to do this, then why was that permissible? Have we just been a little bit too hard-nosed about violence in our estimation of it? No. Whose house was it? He had every right to clear out his dad's house, didn't he? Just like you would have the authority to do that if you were in your father's house. Because not only did he have the right to do that, he had the willingness and he had the ability to back them up. That is extremely manly. Also, I mentioned we read it in Mark 11, we read it in John 2, and they sound awfully similar, but they occur in two completely different areas of the story. It sounds an awful lot like he did it twice. As if he did it once, that already stirred up the hornet's nest. That already got people pretty upset with him. And then 2-3 years later, he comes back and does the same thing again. That takes some, to borrow a Yiddish word, some chutzpah, doesn't it? The second time he did it, it actually directly precipitates his arrest and execution. We stopped short of verse 18 in Mark chapter 11, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. Now, there are plenty of other things that factored into that, of course. But that's the one that really starts things in action, was when he clears out the temple the second time. Turn to Revelation chapter 19. So we've been talking so far, everything that we've looked at has been, with the exception of the number of followers that he has, we've been talking about events that occurred during his life here on earth. But his manliness extends to after his resurrection. In Revelation chapter 19, let's read verses 11 through 16. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So is Jesus really this passive and toothless character? He's pretty far from it, isn't he? And yet, while he has all of these very masculine traits, while he has the ability to act in anger, even to do violence when it's appropriate, what we read here, that's absolutely terrifying. I wouldn't want to get in the way. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that, unless I was a member of his army. I wouldn't want him coming after me. It's terrifying. But his manliness is not the sort of superficial manliness that often causes problems in our world today when it's misused. He has all of these things, all of these traits, under control. That means it's not the facade of manliness that you can see if you go to basically any bar any evening. It's real. Not only does he have the physical characteristics, the physical strengths, but he has the character behind it. Strength of character, strength of will to guide those things. And that is really what makes him a man's man. Let's look at some examples of this. Matthew chapter 26. We'll read verses 47 through 54. Matthew 26, beginning in verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd, with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, Greetings, Rabbi. And he kissed him. Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you came to do. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servants of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so? He could have done that. He could have commanded legions of angels to protect him. He could have let his followers fight for him. But not only does he control his own will to get help, not only does he control his own will to use the powers within his means, within his grasp and his authority, but he stops other people from acting in violence on his behalf in a time when it is not appropriate to do so. He could have used all those things to get out of this, but he didn't. Why? As he says, how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so? It's as simple as that. He sees what has to happen. He sees what is supposed to happen, what God has foretold, what God has decreed. And he says, I'm going to submit myself to that authority and do what needs to be done. He has all that strength, but he has it under control. He also had control over his great influence. We can see this in ourselves even. He doesn't force us to submit to him. He doesn't force us to obey him. We have to make our own decisions. He also didn't misuse his power when he was in the flesh on earth. That often happens. With most of the examples of very masculine men that we looked at in the Bible. Remember when we looked at David? We can find examples of him misusing his influence. Let's look at a couple of examples of a very particular way that Jesus very easily could have misused his power and his influence over people. Turn to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, and we will begin reading in verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. You can see what, we know his name is Simon from other accounts. You can see what Simon has in mind. He knows what sort of woman this is. And he's saying, I can't believe that this man says he's a prophet. If he were, then he wouldn't let her touch him because of the association that comes with it. Do you think that Jesus couldn't have taken advantage of this woman? You think that she wouldn't have been willing to do anything that he said? Okay, that's one example. Let's jump down a little bit and begin at the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1. Soon afterward he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. Do you think that he couldn't have taken advantage of any of them? There are a lot of ridiculous notions out there that don't have any support in the scriptures, that with one particular of these women, Magdalene, that he did have an inappropriate sexual relationship. There's no indication of that, though. Just consider that. He's in this situation, he's in this position, and it's so obvious that that potential is there that people have just assumed that it happened and made up entire stories and mythologies about it. And yet, we don't actually see it happen. That was a huge risk. Jesus was tempted in all things just like we are. But he didn't take advantage of them. Matthew chapter 19. Let's read verses 10 through 12. Instead, even though he was in a position where he could have, and we know that he was tempted, instead we have him saying things like this in Matthew 19, verses 10 through 12. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. His life demonstrates that he was one in that last category. Made himself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. His disciples are saying, I don't know if I can handle that. He was able. He did it. He kept himself under control. Does that mean, though, that he avoided women entirely to shield himself from any temptation, from any appearance of impropriety? Well, obviously not. There was that one instance where this very sinful woman comes right up to him and has her hands on him, and Simon is saying, well, I mean, this doesn't look good, does it? In fact, some of Jesus' closest relationships were with women. Mary and her sister Martha come to mind. Also Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is the first person that he appeared to after he rose from the dead. Deliberately. Some of his closest relationships were with women. And yet they were healthy, responsible, strong, safe relationships. Hardly any men are strong enough in this area to do what Jesus did. He had himself under control, didn't he? He also had control over his stance for what is right. That doesn't mean that he went soft, but he was gentle about it. Turn to John chapter 10. Let's just consider the way that he describes himself here, and consider the comparison he's making and the sorts of things that a shepherd has to do. Beginning in verse 1 of John 10. Truly, truly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, Truly, truly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life, and have it abundantly. He's comparing himself to a shepherd, right? He's talking about the sheep keeping. Now that seems like, okay, well, he's got to be very gentle. He's talking about how the sheep know his voice. They follow him. He has this way with them. The sheep don't trust just anybody, but they trust him because they know him, and they know that he's gentle. They know that he's not there to hurt them. They know that he's going to take care of them, kind of like we were talking about with the kids in the book of Judges, with parents and with God himself, right? He's gentle with his own. He also has control over his physical strength. Right here in John 10, we stopped before we got to verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now we know what happened. We know how he laid down his life. We know what that looked like. We know it looked like submission. And that's what it was. But follow his metaphor. He's saying, I'm the good shepherd. The shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. How does a shepherd generally come into a situation where it's his life for the sake of the sheep? Is it because he's falsely accused of a crime and ends up being arrested and run through a sham trial and then hung up on a cross? It's more like what David, another shepherd, talks about dealing with when he says, Goliath, I've killed lions and bears before. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He is willing to stand up against enormous threats. He's willing to go to his death in order to take care of his sheep. So he has that great physical strength, and he has it under control. And he's willing to use that. He's willing to use that physical strength for the benefit of others, and not just for selfish reasons. And he's willing and able to lay down his life. We also see this, I referred a little bit ago to Ephesians 5, and I would like to jump over there and read just one verse. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Ephesians 5. Shall I get there? Here we go. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We talked about it with sheep and a shepherd just now in John chapter 10. I've brought this verse up a few times in the course of talking about gender roles and men and women and their importance and what they're supposed to be and what God has designed for them to do and to be. That is the manliest thing there is to do. To give yourself up for your fiance, for your spouse. And that's what Jesus did. He died to save his bride. Jesus showed amazing faithfulness. That's really what that is. It's a testament to his faithfulness. Because he could have said, all right, I'm out. I see what's happened to her. I don't want to be a part of it. I'll find another bride. That's fine. Whatever. Plenty of men have done that. Plenty of men have gotten into a situation like that and said, well, when it really comes down to it, self-preservation is my first concern. So I know it's not going to work out so well for her, but I'm going to go that way. I'm going to cut loose while I still can. Jesus honored his commitment. Jesus kept his word. Jesus kept his covenant and died to save the church. Amazing faithfulness to his father, to his friends, to his bride. That is an extremely manly thing to do. And Jesus is indeed a man's man. In fact, Jesus is the best example of manliness that we could ever even hope to see. We see in him all of the positive masculine attributes, things like leading and building and protecting and providing. Those are all there. We don't see any of the masculine pitfalls like drunkenness and promiscuity and arrogance and wanton violence, selfishness, self-promotion, carelessness for those who are in need, irresponsibility, excuse-making. Those are also things that men tend to do, aren't they? And it disappoints us in the men we see around us and in ourselves. Jesus is not any of those things. He's the manliest of all men ever. So, for men, look at him as not just a great example. We probably shouldn't even just say he's the best example. He's the only example worth following in every respect. Imitate him, and you'll be a man. Most men, in general, like to think that we don't really need role models, that we don't really need examples to follow, because if we admit that, then it would tarnish our rugged individualism, you see. In reality, let's go over some brief statistics here. These are things they're horrifying. They're absolutely horrifying. They shouldn't surprise us one bit, though, based on God's design and the consistent instruction that he gave throughout the Bible. 63% of youth suicides. 63% of juveniles who kill themselves have no father in their home. It's a pretty significant majority. That's, I think, the smallest majority of all of these that I have here. 90% of youth runaways and homeless had no father in their home before they left it. 90%. 85% of kids diagnosed with behavioral disorders. No father in the home. 71% of high school dropouts. No father in the home. 70% of kids who are in juvenile detention centers. No father in the home. 75% of kids in substance abuse treatment centers. No father at home. 75%, and this one goes into sort of looking at their futures, but 75% of rapists who were motivated by displaced anger to commit their crimes grew up without a father in their home. 80% of youths that you find in prison No father in the home. 90% of repeat arsonist kids. No father in the home. You're at least twice as likely to end up in jail if you grew up without a father. These are the highest rates of incarceration. That is the best predictor for whether a person will end up in jail or not, is whether they had a father when they were growing up in their home. Kids without a father in the home are also far more likely to be both physically and sexually abused than those who did grow up with a father in the home. And none of these, all these that I've been quoting here, they don't discriminate between boys and girls, so it's everything. But with two exceptions, being the runaways and those who are abused, all of those categories are almost completely populated with boys anyway. These are mostly masculine issues. And that paints a really, really bleak picture for what men without even a halfway decent role model face over the course of their lives. It also shows us the damage done by men who fail to be a good role model. We do need a man we can admire and emulate. And when we lack an earthly one, or even when we just start to see the shortcomings of our earthly role models, we need to look to the heavenly one who does not disappoint and imitate him. So that's for men. Now, women. Compare your sons and husbands, or if you're not married, don't have kids yet, your prospects to the standard set by Jesus. And especially if you're, let's say, you're looking to get married in the future, or as you're raising your kids and trying to decide exactly how to do it, make those choices wisely. And do your best to help the men around you to live up to the standard that Jesus sets. All those statistics that I went through just a moment ago, like I said, they're heavily weighted toward males, but they actually include elevated proportions of girls too. Which is to say, you are if a girl grew up in a home without a father, then she's also more likely to get into those situations than if she had a father. So appreciate the father and husband who never leaves, who's always responsible, who always provides and always protects. And be prepared to safeguard yourself and your children from the effects of men who think they are manly and are not. This world is full of them. And for everybody, do not let things like those statistics determine your course in life, whether for good or for ill. You can't just say, well, I didn't grow up with a dad, therefore it's not really worth trying anymore. Or, well, I grew up with a dad in my home, so I'll be just fine. It doesn't exactly work that way either. Hold on to your heavenly Father, though, and appreciate his care and his discipline and his protection and providence and his instruction. Don't let go of him. And finally, make sure that you are a part of the bride for the best of all possible husbands. You would be crazy to turn down his proposal. Are there better options out there than Jesus? Be alone? I encourage you, don't turn him down. Say yes and enter into an eternal covenant with Christ. Please come now as we stand and sing.
Zion's call sweetly rings
Over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above. While the light from the throne shines for you and me, let us listen to the call of God. Zion's triumph call is ringing clearly, coming from the throne of love in heaven above. All we hear it ringing, let us see the call of love. The road to coming from the throne of love in heaven above. While we hear His singing, let us heed the call of love, of perfect love. While we tarry below, there is work to do, and our strength cometh from above. As we labor and wait, we must all be true. Let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, clearly ringing, coming from the throne of love and heaven above. While we hear it ringing, clearly ringing, let us heed the call of love.
Good to see everyone out here again this evening or this afternoon, I should say. Thank you, Jeremy, for two good lessons today. Good things to think about as we head into our week. Are there any additional announcements that need to be made before we're going to our closing prayer? I do not see any, so at this time we'll have our closing prayer.
Let's pray. Our loving and glorious Father in heaven, we come before you so thankful for this opportunity that you allowed us to come together to sing these songs of praise to you, to worship you. We ask, Father, that you be with all those who are unable to be with us, that you will be with those that are out of town and help them return with us again safely, and be with those that are sick. We are so thankful, Father, for Jesus, for his example that he's given us on how we should live, and for the way you take care of us in everything. We realize everything we have comes from you, and we're so thankful for each and everything. We ask, Father, you be with us as we leave this afternoon, that we'll have a safe journey back to our homes. We ask, Father, you be with us throughout the week, that we will always remember who and what we are, that we'll always be ready to spread your word any opportunity that comes up. Ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yeah.